The Colosseum of Rome towered like a giant stone beast, its arches echoing with the chants of thousands. To the people of the empire, it was more than a stadium. It was the stage of life and death, where suffering itself became a spectacle. Marble seats gleamed under the sun as citizens gathered, eager to be entertained. The emperor's arrival sent a wave of cheers through the crowd. Draped in purple, he raised his hand, commanding silence. A horn blasted, gates creaked open, and the games began. For Rome, this was not sport. It was power on display, a theater of cruelty meant to remind all of the price of defiance. The first prisoners were dragged into the arena, their chains clinking against the sandy floor. These were criminals, rebels, and slaves, condemned not merely to die, but to die in ways that thrilled the masses. The Colosseum's floor had been carefully prepared for blood to soak easily into the sand. At a signal, wooden platforms rose from the underground hypogum, bringing cages filled with beasts. Lions, leopards, and bears growled, their hunger sharpened by deliberate starvation. The crowd roared back, as if beast and man together were bound in one furious chorus of violence. A condemned man was shoved forward, trembling, his eyes darting toward the shadows where the predators paced. He held no weapon, only his bare hands. When the cage was opened, a lion leapt forward with terrifying grace. The prisoner screamed, but the crowd screamed louder, drowning his agony in their cheers. This was known as the damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. It was among the most feared punishments in the empire. To be devoured alive, piece by piece, was not only an execution, but a form of humiliation, stripping the victim of even a dignified death. Sometimes the torment was drawn out intentionally. A prisoner might be bound to a stake while starving animals were released one by one. The crowd would gasp as claws raked flesh, as teeth tore muscle, and as the victim's body convulsed in desperate terror. Every scream was part of the entertainment. On other days, the spectacle was arranged as a mock battle. Prisoners were given wooden shields and dull swords against packs of animals. They tried to fight, but the outcome was always certain. The audience reveled not in their bravery, but in their suffering, which fed the empire's appetite for control. The Colosseum also staged fiery deaths. Some prisoners were tied to stakes wrapped in oil-soaked cloth. A torchbearer would approach, and soon flames climbed their bodies, turning them into writhing human torches. Their shrieks pierced the air while the crowd clapped rhythmically, as though it were a song of Rome's dominance. Others were executed in grotesque theatrical reenactments of myths. A man might be cast as Prometheus, chained while a vulture pecked at his organs. Another might be dressed as Orpheus, only to be torn apart by wild beasts, reenacting tragedy through real human pain. The lines between theater and torture vanished completely. Beneath the arena floor, slaves toiled in darkness, operating winches, cages, and trapdoors. They too lived in fear, for many of them would one day be pushed above to face death themselves. The Colosseum consumed lives endlessly, a machine of cruelty that required constant victims to feed the hunger of its audience. The noise of the crowd was relentless, chants, laughter, and applause echoing off stone. To the spectators, the screams of the condemned blended with the growls of beasts and the clash of steel. Pain became music and death became ritual. Rome's citizens were numbed by repetition, their empathy buried beneath spectacle. In the emperor's eyes, the games served a purpose. They were not only diversions, but instruments of control. By watching others suffer, the people were reminded of Rome's authority. By cheering, they became complicit in the empire's violence, bound to its cruelty as much as the condemned. Yet not all in the audience cheered. Some sat in silence, disturbed by the horrors before them. Philosophers and early Christians condemned the games as barbaric, calling them an insult to human dignity. But their voices were drowned out by the roar of tens of thousands demanding more blood. On days of grand celebration, the scale of cruelty expanded. Hundreds of prisoners were executed in a single festival, their deaths woven into elaborate sequences of combat, fire, and beast hunts. The sand turned to mud beneath the weight of blood, and still the audience cheered, intoxicated by the endless carnage. The prisoners themselves often entered the arena broken, their spirits crushed long before their bodies were destroyed. Shackled in dark cells, they listened to the roar of the crowd above. knowing it would soon be their turn. Hope withered in the stench of damp stone and fear. When they were led into the sunlight, many wept not only for themselves, but for the spectacle their deaths would serve. They knew they were no longer human in the eyes of the empire. They were tools, objects of ridicule, fodder for beasts, and entertainment for the masses. The sand of the Colosseum absorbed centuries of this suffering. Layer upon layer of blood, ash, and bone mingled beneath the feet of Rome's people. Every festival, every execution left behind a trace, an echo of agony that could never be fully erased. As the games of the day dragged on, the audience demanded greater novelty. The organizers obliged with cruel inventiveness. Prisoners were sewn into animal skins and hunted by dogs. Others were crucified within the arena, their bodies left to hang as the crowd feasted on bread and wine. Torture became art, perfected in cruelty. The Colosseum was more than stone and spectacle. It was a mirror of Rome itself. Its grandeur dazzled, its violence horrified, and its bloodshed bound the empire together in a ritual of power. For every cheer that rose, another cry of pain was silenced forever in the sand. The morning games had ended in screams and ashes, but the crowd hungered for more. The sun shifted overhead, casting sharp shadows across the Colosseum's arches as new performers were prepared. This time, it was the turn of the gladiators, men trained to kill but also condemned to bleed for spectacle. For the Romans, gladiators were paradoxical figures. They were slaves, criminals, or prisoners of war. Yet they could achieve fame through violence. The crowd adored their skill, but never forgot that these men were disposable, their lives balanced on the edge of steel, at the mercy of both opponents and audience. The gates creaked open, and pairs of gladiators marched into the arena. They wore different helmets, shields, and weapons to symbolize their class. The heavily armed secutor with rounded helmet, the agile retiarius with net and trident, and many more. Their variety was meant to keep the crowd entertained, but behind the show of ritual, torture lurked. Gladiators were often forced to fight until exhaustion, their bodies beaten long before the killing blow came. Some were starved before combat, their weakened state ensuring a slower, more agonizing struggle as the audience watched them collapse. The clash of steel echoed across the amphitheater. A retiarius hurled his net, tangling the feet of a secutor. The trapped man thrashed, struggling to rise, but his opponent thrust the trident into his shoulder. The crowd roared at the sight of blood, treating agony as triumph. Not all gladiators died quickly. Many were deliberately kept alive, their wounds dragging out the performance. Gashes spilled blood into the sand, while the crowd demanded more blows, more torment. Even when a man begged for mercy, the audience often overpowered the emperor's judgment, calling for his death. The fate of a gladiator was often decided by the infamous gesture of the thumb. If the crowd wished to spare him, they lowered their thumbs. If they wanted him dead, the thumb turned upward or outward, signaling the final strike. Mercy was rare. The Colosseum thrived on cruelty, not compassion. Yet torture was not always in the duel itself. Some gladiators were thrown into hopeless matchups, barely armed slaves against armored professionals, or a single man against many. These uneven contests ensured one outcome: suffering prolonged for amusement. Survival was not the purpose, humiliation was. Outside the arena, gladiators lived under harsh discipline. Their bodies bore scars from training whips, burns from punishments, and wounds from fights they had endured. The gladiatorial schools were prisons disguised as training halls, where torture was both preparation and control. When the gates opened again, a condemned gladiator stumbled into the sand. His armor was broken, his helmet dented, his body smeared with dried blood from earlier combat. The crowd jeered, sensing weakness. Across from him stood a fresh opponent, gleaming in polished armor, ready to cut him down. The fight dragged on, each strike ripping through exhaustion. The condemned man staggered, his shield slipping, his chest exposed. The crowd leaned forward, savoring his fear. His opponent struck a heavy blow that sent him sprawling to the ground, weapon clattering into the dust. The arena grew silent for a heartbeat as the beaten gladiator raised his hand, pleading for mercy. His face was pale, his breath ragged, blood spilling from his wounds. All eyes turned to the emperor, waiting for the decision. But the chants of the crowd drowned out reason. "Kill him! Kill him!" The victor raised his sword high and the final strike plunged down. Blood sprayed across the sand, and the Colosseum erupted in thunderous applause. The corpse was dragged away like discarded waste. One more body fed to the hunger of spectacle. For Rome, death was a sport to be consumed. Not all gladiators were men. Women too were forced into combat for novelty. Their suffering was treated as a special attraction, as though the humiliation of watching women bleed carried even greater delight for the crowd. Their bodies, like the men's, were exploited until broken. Some gladiators resisted, refusing to fight, hoping to reclaim dignity even in death. But refusal meant punishment worse than combat. They might be scourged, burned, or torn apart by beasts while tied defenseless to the ground. The Colosseum allowed no escape from torment. Even when gladiators survived the arena, their bodies carried torture long after the cheers faded. Broken bones healed crooked, infected wounds festered, and scars multiplied. They were living reminders of Rome's appetite for cruelty. Men transformed into walking monuments of pain. Yet to the people of Rome, these men were heroes as much as victims. Children played games imitating gladiator duels. Merchants sold trinkets carved with their names. The crowd shouted their praises, yet in the end, admiration did not shield them from inevitable death. The sand of the Colosseum bore witness to countless duels. Every grain seemed soaked in blood, every echo of steel haunted by the cries of men who fought not for glory, but for survival. Their agony fed the machine of empire, binding citizens together in a ritual of shared cruelty. As the day waned, more pairs entered, more blood was spilled, and more cries filled the sky. The crowd feasted on violence as naturally as bread and wine. To them, the suffering of gladiators was not tragedy, but theater, woven into the rhythm of Roman life. The games continued until the sun dipped low, staining the horizon in crimson light. For the gladiators, night brought only brief reprieve. Tomorrow would bring more fights, more torment, more death. The Colosseum never slept, for cruelty was the empire's eternal performance. The grand finale of the games was always the most brutal. By the time executions began, the crowd was ravenous, their cheers rattling through the arches. What unfolded next was torture disguised as theater, cruelty masked as tradition. The emperor watched from his marble seat, every spectacle a reminder of Rome's absolute power. The prisoners who entered the arena were not just condemned, they were props, cast into roles that mocked the gods and legends of old. One man dressed as Icarus was hurled from a high platform, his wooden wings snapping as his body broke upon the sand. Another, forced to play Hercules, was chained and set against starving lions. His cries mingled with the beasts' roars, delighting the crowd. Entire groups of prisoners were often massacred together. Surrounded by armed gladiators, they were cut down in waves, their blood soaking the sand. The spectacle was less about combat than humiliation, a reminder that Rome's enemies would always die dishonored. Fire gave the arena its most horrifying finales. Prisoners tied to stakes were drenched in oil and set ablaze, their writhing silhouettes flickering against the twilight sky. Musicians played, drowning out screams with shrill flutes and horns, as if pain itself were orchestrated. For Christians, the Colosseum became a place of martyrdom. Accused of defying Rome's gods, they were fed to beasts or burned before tens of thousands. Yet instead of begging, many sang hymns, their voices trembling but unbroken, unsettling the audience that expected only despair. The underground chambers were no less terrifying. Shackled in darkness, prisoners heard the roar of the crowd above, the growls of beasts nearby. Every sound was a countdown to their own suffering. Some collapsed before ever reaching the sand, crushed by terror long before execution. Political power also fueled the games. Victorious generals paraded captured soldiers into the arena, forcing them into staged battles or mock naval fights in a flooded Colosseum. Defeat was certain, and death came slowly, often by drowning or the sword. Even Rome's religious festivals absorbed this cruelty. Executions were staged as offerings to the gods, turning torture into ritual. The crowd saw it not as brutality, but as piety, proof that Rome's dominance had divine blessing. Yet whispers of dissent grew louder. Philosophers condemned the bloodshed. Christians carried stories of martyrdom across the empire. The Colosseum, once a symbol of glory, became in time a symbol of Rome's hunger for cruelty. As the empire weakened, the spectacles dwindled. Beasts became too costly, wars too draining, and the crowds less eager. The gates closed more often, the sands fell silent, and the arena that once pulsed with death became a hollow shell of its past. Today, the Colosseum still stands, a monument of magnificence shadowed by horror. Beneath its arches linger invisible stains, the echoes of screams, the memory of flames, and the ghosts of thousands who died as Rome's entertainment.